Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Where's European leadership when the continent needs it most? EU states, Germany most notably, have been dragging their heels when it comes to providing Ukraine with modern weaponry. With the conflict due to carry on into its next year, our next guest argues Europe should be going even further and planning for life after the war with Ukraine in the EU. That's something that's not going to please Vladimir Putin. It is in part why the conflict began. Our next guest is Gerald Knaus. He's the founder of the European Stability Initiative, an influential think tank. Hello and welcome, Gerald.
Hello. Good evening.
Welcome from Berlin. Thanks very much indeed. I should say, of course, the EU already goes up to Russia's borders. You've got Finland, you've got the Baltic states, but having Ukraine within the EU be a whole new deal. That's essentially why the Maidan revolution began. I want you to come on to in a second to why that is important, why it's important to you, why you think it's of advantage to Europe. But just take us back to 2014. Why did Putin object to it?
Well, let's understand why young Ukrainians twice, in 2004 and in 2014, went into the streets of Kiev. They saw a country, and I lived in Ukraine in the early 90s, that was falling further and further behind its immediate European neighbors. They saw Poland and the Baltic states and Romania, all of which are neighboring Ukraine, make tremendous economic strides. Romania today has a per capita GDP higher than that of Croatia. It's 70% of the EU average. It used to be 25%. And so Ukrainians, as they live close to the EU, as they move and travel to the EU, especially the younger ones, were asking a very simple question. If that is possible in Lithuania, in Estonia, in Poland, in Romania, why can't Ukraine have a similar future as a prosperous, stable, less corrupt democracy integrating with Europe? The trouble is that that model is exactly the opposite of what has emerged in Russia under Vladimir Putin. And so when Ukrainians started pushing for their country to be integrated economically more and more with the EU, to have a European perspective, one problem was doubts inside the EU, but the more immediate, serious problem was that this was seen in the Kremlin as Ukraine escaping, rightly, from Russia's grasp, economically, but most importantly, politically and culturally. So the protests in 2014, which of course led to enormous violence, amazingly courageous demonstrators in Kiev, braving snipers, which led to the pro-Putin Ukrainian president fleeing the country, and which saw Ukraine reform its institutions, but also saw Russia responding by seizing Crimea and basically invading Ukraine by supporting, well, it's wrong to say supporting separatists, creating a separatist movement with Russians largely in the lead, supported by the Kremlin in eastern Ukraine. We've basically had 8 years of war and 8 years of Ukrainian efforts to try to move to the West.
I was going to say, I think people forget that it was actually the association agreement, the agreement between Ukraine and the EU that would have brought Ukraine slightly closer to Europe, given it access to European markets, improved, and basically the first step towards applying towards EU membership. It was that agreement that angered the Kremlin so much.
Yes, it was, and that is very important in terms of confronting Russian propaganda. It was not because Ukraine felt in 2014 threatened by Russia, and it was not because Ukrainians in 2014 wanted to join NATO to threaten Russia. It was a vision of a different, more integrated, more prosperous, less corrupt, more stable, more mainstream EU European country. And that was seen as a threat by Putin. And in response to this, what many people missed, including many in the West, was that the Ukraine of 2022 was indeed not the Ukraine of 2014. A lot of efforts had gone into changing institutions, strengthening governance, definitely very visibly strengthening Ukraine's armed forces. There were basically none prepared in 2014. Ukraine did not expect to be fighting Russia. In 2014, Ukrainians in Kiev, I was in Kiev for most of the summer of 2015, and I'd lived in Ukraine before. I'd learned Russian in Ukraine. I spoke Russian in Kiev in 2015. This was not an anti-Russian society. It was an anti-Putin's vision of the future society. But the longer the war lasted, and of course, seizing Ukrainian territory, which was a terribly, a real taboo being this was a taboo to seize territory of another country, which is what Russia did in 2014. And the war in the East, of course, turned Ukraine more and more against Russia. And the invasion in February, which many Ukrainians did not expect, did not think possible, has finally brought clarity, at least to this issue, that today, and it has been the Russian-speaking cities in the east of the country, where the fighting has been the most ferocious, where there has been massive resistance in Kharkiv, in Mariupol, where, of course, the president who's leading Ukraine today is a native Russian speaker. But it is clear today that even the Russian-speaking Ukrainians are, above all else, Ukrainians, and the country has come together. And not only this, it has proven to be resilient, and that's been a surprise to many Europeans.
Okay, and in a bit, I'm going to come to your argument as to why Europe should be getting on and moving ahead with advancing the EU membership process for Ukraine. And that's there's a complex bureaucratic process that we'll come to in a second. And there's a debate in Europe about whether that should take place or not. And we'll come to that in a moment. But I really want to come to the most fundamental thing. I'm here in Eurosceptic Britain, where we view the EU as a bureaucracy. And I think the most you're speaking to are largely what we call, or what the French might call, an Anglo-Saxon audience. So we've got people in the States, got people in Australia watching. And at its most fundamental level, what's the EU about?
Well, what we are seeing at the moment, or what we saw in 2022 in response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, is an incredible clarification. Europe today is essentially divided into two very unequal halves. Although half is wrong, because on the one hand, we have Russia and Belarus, clear dictatorships where political opponents are imprisoned, where you have political prisoners, where you have state violence against their own citizens. Then you have a European Union that has kept expanding, with the exception of Britain, where the interesting thing, of course, is that opinion polls show most British citizens are regretting the decision that was made, because really nothing's got better as a result of Brexit. And it's very hard for those who proposed Brexit to actually point to anything that's got better. But okay, leave Britain aside. The EU is not an empire. Anybody can leave at any moment. So the astonishing thing is actually that since this process of European integration was launched, people have wanted to join, and except for the United Kingdom, nobody's ever wanted to leave. They they could, that was shown, but nobody's wanting to leave. And the clarity that was brought in 2022 was that the immediate response, not only by Ukraine, but also by Moldova and Georgia, to the Russian invasion, was to apply for EU membership. So what we have actually at this moment, despite Brexit, actually in some ways a direct response to some of the doubts Brexit raised, this is the European project coming to a standstill. No, we have more countries wanting to join the EU now than we've had in 20 years. All the Balkan countries, Kosovo has applied for accession, Moldova has applied for accession, Ukraine has applied within days. Kyiv was under threat of being taken. There was a siege of the capital, and yet the president and his government decided And the reason, and this is perhaps the best answer to your question, is that it is becoming clear that there is a Europe of peace and prosperity where borders are being made invisible, which is essentially the Europe of the European Union, plus a few neutral countries essentially fully integrated into the European Union, like Norway or even Switzerland. There is the Europe of NATO membership. Again, Sweden and Finland have shown their immediate response to the invasion was to apply for NATO accession. So the geopolitical picture in Europe is becoming much simpler. And there are those countries that want to belong to this Europe of prosperity and stability, desperate to get in. And the question for the Europeans is not so much what do they want. The question is for the EU citizens, the EU members today, is how do they respond to what Ukrainians or Moldovans want?
Yeah. So in response to that, what I was going to say was that I mean, I think outside it's seen, yes, as a political bloc, but also as a trading bloc, an economic community out of that's what its origins were in. But at its very fundamental level, it's existential. You think of all the countries who've joined, after the Second World War, whether they've been affected by dictatorship or occupation, there are very fundamental reasons why you want to belong, and that's perhaps in a way why Britain has a different relationship, because it didn't see that it needed to belong to that grouping, mistakenly in my view. But there we go. So with that in mind, if you think that this is there's such source of stability, why is Europe so hesitant about dealing with Ukraine, both politically and in terms of military terms as well? If we look at the deployment of weapons, Germany, the main military power within Europe, within Europe, there's the UK as well, but it's outside the EU, not providing tanks. France, very reluctant to provide weapons. That's on the military side. If we to look at the enlargement process and how you deal with countries joining the European Union, there's also that division as well.
Well, I think it's useful to break this apart. But I mean, let's start with the question of why are some of the big players in Europe, and let's focus on France and Germany, reluctant to see the Union enlarge? We have a second debate, which is why is there a difficulty? And it's a very intense and interesting debate, and it's certainly a very, very fluid debate in Germany. But why has it proven difficult to supply the kind of weapons that Ukrainians have requested and that other Europeans are supplying?
Let's talk about the weapons first, because I think a longer conversation, because I think people are going to be more aware about that subject. Yeah. And then we'll talk about the idea. This is come on to your main argument, which is about how and why it's important to bring Ukraine within the EU. But let's deal with the weapons thing first.
Yes, and that makes a lot of sense, because of course, if Ukraine doesn't win the war, all this talk about EU integration is is futile. So Ukraine first needs to be able to defend its territory. For this, it needs two things, and there's a third thing that matters a lot, which is Europeans accepting the largely women and children who fled to the European Union. It's the biggest refugee movement in the history of Europe since the 1940s. So there, European countries have been incredibly open. 4.7 million refugees have fled to the EU. But of course, the point is not, and this is Russia's strategy, to accept millions of refugees. The point is to enable them to return. Most of them want to. And for this, Ukraine needs to take back territory. And there is a clear awareness that in order to defend itself and take back the territory that Ukraine has lost, it needs weapons it hasn't yet received. So let me take Germany. In February, before Russia's invasion, the members of the current government, all of them, including the foreign minister of the Green Party, who's been the most outspoken party in the government, talking about supplying, including battle tanks. In February, the argument that Annalena Baerbock made was Germany cannot send weapons to a conflict zone. It would be seen as provocative. That was, of course, one of the strongest arguments among the Greens, but also particularly, and it's enduring, among some social democrats. that Germany was a civil power, that it was a mistake to try to provoke Russia. Remember, Angela Merkel was completely against supplying weapons to Ukraine. This was February.
Was called
now, compared to this, the situation has changed completely. Yeah, we have a completely different situation. And just breaking it down, for those who don't know German politics in more detail, we have a three-member coalition: the Liberals, Social Democrats, and the Greens. Social Democrats put up the Chancellor and the Minister of Defense. The Foreign Minister is Green. In each of the three parties, from almost the beginning of the war, there have been very strong voices saying Germany should supply with Ukraine with whatever is needed. So the argument and the symbol here has been the battle tank issue. I mean, first, tanks in general, or including transport. But secondly, the battle tanks. Germany is producing one of the best battle tanks that most European countries have bought, the Leopard 2 tank. I think 14 countries in Europe have it. And on the issue of whether Germany should supply the Ukrainian military with Leopard 2 battle tanks, you have the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who's a Social Democrat, the chair of the Europe Affairs Committee, who's a Green, and the chair of the Defense Committee, who's a Liberal, all three of them calling since the summer that Germany should do it. So this is a debate in parliament within the party groups. Within the government, you've had the foreign minister and the vice chancellor, who's the minister of economy, also calling for Germany to supply Ukraine with battle tanks and Leopard 2s. You had the chancellor and the minister of defense basically being dragged into supplying weapons, always hiding behind one argument. And, I'm not sure what's the real thinking, because the argument that has been made is Germany can only supply certain weapons together with others. Now, the truth has been that each time other countries have stepped forward, Germany has been following. So when the Dutch proposed to send the HIMAR artillery, Germany followed. When now the debate is on transport tanks, not the Leopard 2, but others. And there has been pressure from France. France said, okay, we supply some. Germany has followed. And the end result is that Germany is supplying a lot of weapons. And I think it's only a question of time. But of course, the question is, why isn't Germany leading? And that, I think, has a lot to do with the incredible trajectory from February last year to, now it's very soon February, so exactly 1 year later, the incredible trajectory of a country that really didn't expect to need its military to face a war in Europe, and certainly to support an army in a war in Europe. I think by February, 1 year after the war will start, we are likely to see Germany as part of a coalition of European countries, probably with the UK and the US, to provide cover to the Chancellor, supplying the battle tanks Ukraine needs. And that's been, in historic terms, a relatively quick turnaround. Seen from the Ukrainian perspective, it's been painfully slow because, of course, these supplies would have saved lives. And the sooner Ukraine is able to prepare for the spring to train with those battle tanks, the better for Ukraine. But I actually think that this debate is all going in one direction in Germany, and the direction is towards supplying Ukraine. The question is only, will it be fast enough, and how extensive will it be? But I think it's clear that it will happen.
Thank you, Gerald, for that sort of overview. It's been very useful. I think one should add that France, too, has been pretty slow. And I think Macron saw himself as an important guy who could have Putin's ear, certainly in the earlier months of the war. And only very recently has it begun to supply weapons too. I mean, you'd say just before Germany has really got into that conversation. So quite belatedly, too. It would seem to me Europe doesn't realise, when it comes to Ukraine, what its fundamental values are. It's only come round reluctantly to what's at stake here. And that also that idea applies to your argument when it comes to actually bringing Ukraine into the European Union. First of all, why is it essential you think that Ukraine should be in and not out? At the beginning, you outlined why people within Ukraine, young people, want to become part of the EU. I'm asking about from within the EU's point of view, from the European Union's point of view.
I mean, let me add one more thing. There is a German who's played a very important role, and that's been the president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She's visited Ukraine twice. She has actually spoken out for supplying Ukraine with all these weapons that the Ukrainians have demanded. She has pushed the European Commission and the European Union to, for the first time in its history, actually have a massive military program of funding weapons for Ukraine. And on the issue you raise of explaining why it's in the EU's interest to embrace Ukraine and offer a perspective of membership, she's been in the lead. I mean, in her State of the EU speech, the State of the Union speech that takes place every September in the European Parliament, she has argued for this, essentially saying that Ukraine is fighting on behalf of all of European democracies. I mean, that's been the view of a lot of European members, not just the Baltic states and Poland that are the most threatened, but also countries like Denmark, Sweden, which is neutral, but of course about to join NATO, the Czech Republic. Many countries have described this battle as one that Ukrainians aren't just leading to defend themselves against an invasion, but that if Ukraine would be defeated, all of Europe would be threatened. And the reverse is true also. If Ukraine would be successful, all of Europe would be more stable and secure than it has ever been. But there is, of course, in addition to the military side, where Ukraine has surprised many with its resilience, a very visible Russian strategy to destroy the Ukrainian economy, to destroy its infrastructure. And if you look at this and you ask yourself, how can this possibly be rebuilt? You know, the World Bank has estimated by last summer already that the damage was more than 300 billion euros. And by now it must have doubled, because the Russian efforts have very consistently tried to destroy the electricity grid, the infrastructure, to mine the country, to destroy what makes an economic and normal life possible. If you ask yourself, how can this ever be rebuilt? Then it is very clear that without Ukraine becoming fully part and having a perspective of being fully part of the European single market and having the same possibilities, including, of course, the security that is essential to attract any investment. So the package of guaranteeing Ukrainian security whenever that war ends, where the Ukrainians hope for NATO membership, and the demand by Ukrainians to be integrated into the single market, to give the same signal to investors that Ukraine will be part of this bigger European economic space that has worked wonders in the Baltic states, in Poland, in Romania, and elsewhere, any country that joined. This is essential for a credible vision of post-war Ukraine. And that is why in the middle of the war, at the very beginning, in the middle of the Battle of Kiev, in the very beginning of the war, you had these Ukrainian civil servants and the Ukrainian government sit in Kiev while its soldiers were fighting in the suburbs, filling out the technical issues, the questionnaire the commissioner sent, not as an exercise in bureaucratic activism, not as a symbolic step, but because Ukrainians know if they are to have a future as a prosperous state post-war, this is the moment to lock in the European sympathy for Ukraine and make sure that Ukraine will not be left in a vacuum. And that is where it has allies in the Commission, it has allies in Eastern Europe, it has some allies in Germany, but it still needs to persuade skeptics. And the
Okay,
skeptics have one simple argument.
Let me pause you there, because I want to give people an opportunity to ask questions. So that we've got people in Australia, we've got people in the US, we've got people in the UK, and if you can put your questions in the Q&A box, you may want to ask Gerald questions about German politics. He's very familiar with that too. But the key focus here is what advantage is there in bringing Ukraine into the EU or planning that at this very moment? That's that's Gerald's fundamental argument here. Sticking with this, Gerald, it's Europe's had huge problems accepting new members full stop. Why on earth is it going to start planning for a country that's in the middle of the war, where its territory's not secure, where you've got large parts of Ukraine already occupied and maybe occupied for some time? Why start a process with that in that situation?
Well, because Europeans, those who argue for it, including many here in Berlin, including myself and our colleagues, and of course, most importantly, the Ukrainians themselves, what they are saying is that this isn't a gift. A Ukraine that is stable, economically integrated, that has a prospect and a future as a functioning market economy and stable democracy, like its neighbors, is a huge asset to the EU. I mean, what people realized with the beginning of the war, in terms of agriculture, in terms of energy, in terms of raw material, but most importantly, in terms of its population, Ukraine makes Europe stronger and more secure. The Ukrainian army, every day it is fighting and reducing Russia's military capacity, makes the Baltic states and Poland, and that means the whole of NATO and the EU, more secure. A Ukrainian democracy that turns to Europe would be an incredibly powerful signal to Belarus. If Ukraine succeeds in this war and succeeds as an economy, Moldova, and I've spent a lot of time last year traveling to Moldova, and I should say on all these issues, I'm in constant contact with the Moldovan government, the foreign minister, the deputy prime minister in Ukraine. We've had a lot of discussions, debates, how to make the argument. So this is not an academic exercise. What the Ukrainians are saying and what the Moldovans are saying is, if Ukraine succeeds, Moldova is secure. Another European democracy. So the effect on the European project, not in an abstract way, but as a vision of a Europe in which democracies are more secure, in which autocracies, Belarus and Russia at the moment, are unable to threaten democracies, in which Europe is economically more powerful, and in which democracy and the idea of a pan-European structure based on the rule of law and human rights is not just an abstract utopia, but a realistic vision. For all of this, giving Ukraine and responding to the Ukrainian demand is essential. And the interesting thing, just one more sentence on this. I mean, what was the European response? Ukraine submitted an application for membership in the middle of the war. The European Commission, in a record time, looked at the Ukrainian application, sent a questionnaire, responded to this, and recommended in the summer to give Ukraine official candidate status. And although there was a lot of doubt whether it would happen, the European Union responded, gave Ukraine in the summer official candidate status. The next step that is now needed is first to open accession talks. And I've been in Stockholm twice in the last 2 months. Sweden now holds the EU presidency. It's setting an agenda. This Swedish government is totally committed to try to put the opening of accession talks on the agenda. It might happen.
Okay, go. Let's. I've got plenty more questions about that specific issue, but let's take a question from Sheila de Belay. Go ahead, Sheila.
Hello. I wondered if you could comment on the position of Hungary in all this.
Yes. Well, the war has clarified a lot of things that were visible before. And one thing it has clarified is that Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, who is now the longest serving leader of any government in Europe, now that Angela Merkel has stepped down, that Viktor Orban sees his friends more in the Kremlin than in Kiev. Amazingly, he has picked personal fights with the president of Ukraine. Hungary has consistently argued that the sanctions against Russia are a mistake. But at the same time, what has also been clarified is that if the rest of the Union and some of the big countries are determined, the ability of Viktor Orban and Hungary to blackmail and stop the rest of the EU acting has been limited. So despite all the arguments about sanctions being a problem, Hungary went along. It didn't stop Ukraine receiving candidate status. And despite the fights and Hungary's diplomatic efforts to keep, including trips to Moscow by the foreign minister, by the prime minister, in 2022, to keep the doors open to Moscow, so far, this has not affected EU policy. So the good thing is that the EU has shown that it is able to act. The bad thing is that it's become very visible that some countries, Hungary in the lead, are ideologically really trying to undermine this unity. They've just been too weak to be successful.
But it's not just Hungary, is it, Gerald? When it comes to EU enlargement, Europe is divided much more fundamentally than that.
No, I'm talking about sanctions. I'm talking about where the sympathy lies. You know, no other country.
But if you're talking about this question of actually trying to bring in Ukraine, which you can understand would boost, as you say, it could be a boost for the economy in the long term, provide political stability, security for Europe more generally. That hasn't been the case. If you look at the Western Balkans, that's where your organisation really has its roots. If you look at Bosnia, Serbia, you look at countries like Montenegro and Macedonia that have made quite reasonable reforms that are required of them in order to apply for EU membership. Really, they've been left by the side. The negotiations process has really some of those negotiations haven't even started. And France in particular has made it very clear it doesn't want to see this kind of enlargement unless there's further European integration.
Yes, at the same time, everybody knows that the kind of European integration France is asking for, and it's partly a bit vague actually, might never happen. So there is also a doubt to what extent France is honest about this, and to what extent it isn't really just an argument that France says the union is too big already. I mean, this is what President Macron has been saying publicly. He's been making statements for the last 3 years saying that it weakens Europe. And remember, he campaigned as a pro-EU president. He won elections twice, talking about European sovereignty. And in his mental map of Europe, a sovereign Europe, a strong Europe, can't be too big. And he's been saying this. So you're right. France has been slowing down the accession process for the Western Balkans. It's not been alone. Other countries have done so as well. And the result has been an accession process that in the Western Balkans lost all credibility, with rising risks of new nationalist-driven confrontations. So what my colleagues and myself have been doing, and again, this has been part of a campaign with others in the European Parliament, the former Prime Minister of Lithuania, Kubilius, one of the 3 Baltic states, who's now in the European Parliament, has created a massive network of members of parliaments united for Ukraine. And I just recently traveled with Andrius Kubilius to Sweden, and we did a lot of debates also with the Ukrainians, arguing that in response to doubts in France and elsewhere, the European Union should really reform its accession process to make it credible. And one way to do that is to say, listen, Europeans are not at the moment united on the end goal, whether it's possible to have 37 members. But what we need to do now at this moment is to send a signal that there is a very credible interim goal that all Europeans could agree on. And that would be offering access to the single market. And you've said it at the beginning. The European project, when it started, especially with the Treaty of Rome in 1957, was about one big promise. It was peace through cooperation in institutions by creating a free zone of the four freedoms, freedom of movement for goods, capital, services, and people. So a Europe without barriers. It's, I think, wrong to say it's mainly economic. It was always a political vision, but the tool to achieve the political vision and the focus of the European institutions was to create a single market. This has been a tremendous success, so successful that indeed everybody has wanted to join. And so what I think is the way forward, and I've discussed this with many European governments, and we've had these debates in civil society, including with the Ukrainians, the Moldovans, is that the European Union, to address the French concerns about having 37 members, without sending a terrible signal to Ukrainians and Moldovans, and indeed to the Balkans, that they will be left in a waiting room, in limbo, the European Union should say, if these countries meet the requirements to join the EU, and they can do that within 4 or 5 years, this is how long it took Romania. You know, that's realistic. Of course, assuming that Ukraine wins its war, the moment they meet the requirements, even if the Union has not reformed in the way Macron and others are demanding, they will then anyways be led into the single market. And that means there will be no barriers for people, goods, services, and capital. And that, of course, has been what the European project was about the first 40 years. You know, from 1950 to 1992, the Maastricht Treaty, the European Union was a single market. That was the core. And by sending a signal that it depends on the reform efforts of Ukrainians and Moldovans and Serbs and Albanians and Bosnians, if they do the reforms, they can join this single market. You're also sending a strong signal, not only to the people, but also to investors, that it is not an endless process leading nowhere, which it has become in the Balkans, but a European integration process with a credible entry.
Essentially, at the moment you're saying is that accession process is an empty promise. It's a sort of carrot. You know, people are going through the process, and in reality, membership is still as far off as it ever was. And you're trying to make this a concrete process. Just summarising what you were saying.
Yes, and one more thing: this is not a radical new idea. This is how countries like Austria, Finland, and Sweden joined the EU, because when they applied, there was a doubt in France about having too many members. And so the French, and then the French Commission president said, hey, wait, Austria, Sweden, and Finland, you can't join the EU now. We first need to reform it. But you can join the single market. So Austria, Sweden, Finland, and Norway first negotiated to join the single market. It was called the European Economic Area. And once they were in the single market, the politics had changed. France was then okay with enlargement. And they were then 1 year later, with the exception of Norway, joining the EU. And Norway has remained in that single market. So what we are proposing for Ukraine and Moldova is not only something that has already been done once, it's also something that exists now. Because Norway, of course, is fully part of the single market and is not a member of the EU.
I'm going to ask a question. I was watching one of the discussions you did late last year, and I think it was with a European Parliament, some kind of assembly. I'm not entirely too sure what it was, but there was a French member there who asked you the question, and more specifically, I mentioned this earlier on. He said, can you imagine Ukraine entering the single market with a war going on? It's highly likely that if there is a conflict, it might not be resolved. You might have some kind of stalemate. Are you really saying that Ukraine should join with that situation?
Well, yes, and let's start with, let's be concrete. What does joining the single market mean? It means, first of all, Ukrainians have the right, like Norwegians, like all EU members, to move freely in the EU, to work everywhere. They already got this right temporarily as refugees. Any Ukrainian citizen, and I think particularly for Americans, this is an interesting notion. I mean, this is a big country, more than 40 million inhabitants. Any Ukrainian, despite the war, can, of course, travel visa-free to Europe, but can also reside and work in every European country. So the big fear, what would we do if we give freedom of movement? Well, it's already been given. Ukrainians already have it. The only thing now is not to take it away at any moment. Now, when it comes to other things like energy, I mean, it's clear the Ukrainian energy system, which was very integrated with Russia, I mean, these ties have all been cut. Ukraine has joined the European electricity system in February, March last year.
So by default, all these things are happening already.
Yes, so a lot of this is happening. Inside Ukraine, its trade, of course, has been completely turned around. That's been a gradual process for the last 15, 20 years, dramatically accelerated by the war. Ukraine is training with the EU, so adopting the standards. And then Europe saying, well, in response to you adopting the standards, we are going to allow your goods to come freely. You know, it's a huge challenge. It's been a challenge for Romania or Lithuania or Bulgaria or any country that joined, but it's something that is already ongoing. When it comes to things like European economic support for reconstruction, the amount of money that will be needed, it's much easier to mobilize if it's seen as an investment in building a member state. You know, making the investment so that when you rebuild institutions, when you rebuild infrastructure, you do it with the vision that this Ukraine will be fully part of Europe. I mean, I give you an example. For agricultural exports from Ukraine, you need to dramatically increase the ability to transport, because there have been these tensions in the Black Sea. There is this constant fear. You know, there have been the negotiations mediated by Turkey and the UN on letting Ukraine export grain from Odessa. But at the same time, it's clear Ukraine needs to be able to export much more across the land routes. There needs to be investment. If you make this investment, and I talked to the German Minister of Agriculture, who said that if we want to make this massive investment in increasing train links, transport links, it's much easier to do that if we think of Ukraine in transport and energy terms as part of the integrated European single market. So for the vision of rebuilding the country, and in a way we basically, the Ukrainians are required to rebuild it while Russia is destroying it, so that they can keep up the energy grids, the transports, the essential exports of Ukrainian agriculture. The vision of Ukraine as a member of the EU is a vital framework. And honestly, with all the skepticism about the European response and all the doubts in Paris and the obstructionist rhetoric from Budapest, so far, the response of the Europeans has surprised me by being visionary enough. And the leadership by the Commission, who's really grown in this crisis, by the President von der Leyen and others, has been crucial.
I want to expand this conversation beyond Ukraine. Your think tank is very influential within Brussels and elsewhere. It covers the Balkans. You don't do a lot of talking about Brexit, and I haven't written very many papers about Brexit, but I do want to come to that as well. And if people have their own questions, please do put more down in the Q&A box, which may be at the bottom of your screen, everyone. First of all, let's take a question from Hilary Matthews, and that's about Germany. Go ahead, Hilary, and we can hear you.
Yes, hello. I just saw in the press recently that the German defense minister has just resigned. And I wondered if that was because of her opposition to provide tanks to Ukraine. And where are we in Germany? Will Germany give those tanks and weapons to Ukraine soon? Or how exactly does the government stand at the moment? It seems a bit weak.
Well, I mean, the defense minister has cut a sorry figure in the last year, because she's kept saying that Germany can't supply certain things, only to then supply them. And the arguments she's used have basically all broken down. Germany said we can't afford to send certain armored vehicles, certain artillery, certain air defense systems. And then she did. so her credibility has been very low. She also had a lot of communication issues. I mean, very unfortunate message that she recorded looking back at the last year at the end, which really looked embarrassing. But the fundamental problem was not her personal position, but this debates inside the government. But the trend has been very clear. Germany is supplying more and more of what the Ukrainians want. And as I said in the beginning, I predict that the way the debate is going now, the way the vice chancellor, the foreign minister, the key people, the chairs of the key committees, the opposition, the CDU, CSU opposition has been asking for battle tanks to be supplied. I think it is, especially if Britain and France and the US, by saying that they are also prepared to send these weapons, taking away the last argument of the chancellor, which has been, we don't want to do it alone. I predict that this drawn-out debate, in particular on the battle tanks, on the Leopards 2, is going to end soon with Germany supplying them. I mean, that's my prediction. I've had a number of debates together with the chair of the Europe Affairs Committee, who's a Green politician, Toni Hofreiter, who's become one of the most outspoken voices in the German debate, asking for these battle tanks to be supplied since last spring.
Gerald, I want to come on to in a second Russia's influence elsewhere and how the split between EU and Russia, the EU and Russia, is being playing out in the Western Balkans, and that's been going on for some time. But let's take another question from Sheila de Leeg first. Go ahead, Sheila.
Hello, Gerald. I'm wondering if you might agree with the view put forward by Jonathan Friedland in The Guardian last weekend, that Brexit has strengthened EU unity because other countries have looked at what's happening to us and have said, no, thanks.
I think that's true. I think that you see it in the changing position of anti-European parties, both Le Pen in France and parties in Italy that 6 years ago, talked about Frexit and, leaving the EU, leaving the euro. You had these positions from parties with some influence in many European countries, and they've dropped that. Now, that's not reassuring because it just shows how opportunistic they are, but it's a response to a public sense that increasingly people across Europe are just looking at Britain and saying, what were they thinking?
Gerald, I was taking a stroll along the Thames with somebody, they'll know who they are, and he said he couldn't see any problems thus far. Brexit's come and gone, and really Britain hasn't changed that much economically. What's the view you think from among European policymakers, and what's your view?
I mean, I don't live in Britain, so I just read the press and I talk to British friends. But I see, the economic data is pretty clear. No economy has been doing worse than the British. And if you listen to, if you pose questions to a guy I used to debate with at the Oxford Union when I was a student, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who was already then arguing that Europe was a bad idea in 1989, 1990, right? Yeah. So if you listen to him now being asked, give us the benefits of Brexit, and he can't come up with any. And then you look at the economic data. The big question, and here we come to an interesting issue. I think both Brexit and Putin, Brexit in a way that only affects Britain, not really the rest of Europe, Putin in a dramatic way, have created a myth of the European Union. The European Union is not a state and it is not an empire. Anybody can leave. That is its strength. Countries stay in because they want to. What Putin doesn't understand is how can a union where you don't have a central player that is a power that controls everyone stay together? in his vision, it's the US that somehow, or somebody must be forcing countries. His people, and I spent some time in Moscow as a Carnegie Fellow in 2015, and all these Kremlin intellectuals were expecting the Union to collapse anytime soon. They saw it as an American empire, and once you remove the US influence, it would collapse and the nation states would reemerge and be free. And then, of course, Russia, as the biggest nation state, could reassert its influence, divide and rule. But it didn't happen because the European Union is not an empire. And at the same time, as a result of Brexit, Britain didn't gain more freedom of movement. What is it that Britain can do now that it couldn't do before? I mean, it's a very basic question. There's been a question posed by the former Commission president after Brexit to the members of the EU to ask them seriously, listen, Brexit has been a shock. Perhaps we should be discussing if there are any powers that the Union has that we should give back to member states. Tell me which powers you want back. And no member state could think of anything because the powers the Union has have been conferred on the Union with the consent of member states. The EU institutions, the Commission, and this is perhaps the simplest way to explain it to people outside the Union. There isn't a single EU executive body that can arrest a European. You don't have an FBI, a National Guard, a drug enforcement agency. The Union's power to enforce its own laws rests on the institutions of the member states. There are European courts, but they cannot order a European police, FBI, any enforcement agency because they don't exist. So there is no empire, there's no force, there's no power at the center. I think in the US, there are dozens of executive bodies at the federal level. You don't have that. And that is the strength, because that means that the Union only sticks together because of a constant process of negotiation based on the interests of the member states, the powers that are given to EU institutions, and their ability to exercise these powers is based on a constant need to ensure consensus.
Okay, and Gerald, that's its strength, and there's a consensus there, and there's been a slow-moving sort of development of economic and political integration that the vast majority of people, and certainly the states, have worked towards, and the vast majority of people perhaps support within the EU. But coming back, I do want to come back to this idea of European division, and coming back in particular to the Western Balkans. It's very sad for me to read the headlines about Kosovo, about Bosnia, that really have not changed that much since the time that I covered that region between 1999 and 2009. If you see Vucic, who's the president of Serbia, see Milorad Dodik, who's the leader of Republika Srpska, that's the Serbian half of Bosnia-Herzegovina, they play the two sides. They play, they're very willing to be seen reviewing Russian troops, to be basically showing an allegiance that's far closer to Russia than to the EU. And it seems to me that Europe really hasn't paid attention. You were talking to this about this earlier, and I'd like you to go into that in a bit more detail before we wrap up in about 5 to 8 minutes.
Yes. Well, I think one addition to the picture you present, what you say, and I think you're completely right, that there were a lot of hopes after a decade of war in the Balkans. The war in 91, Croatia 92 to 95, in Bosnia 99, Serbia, Kosovo. That after that, there was a lot of hope that the Balkans would go the same path as the Baltic states and the Central European countries, where essentially war becomes, among members, becomes unthinkable. And I mean, this is, again, very important point. Today, nobody, I mean, it would be madness, and nobody in Europe thinks it is necessary for the Dutch to prepare a scenario that Germany might attack the Netherlands, or for the Hungarians and Romanians to fear each other's armies, or for Lithuania and Poland, which had real tensions in the interwar period. Today, conflict among EU members is unthinkable. And the expectation in 1999 was that the same was happening in the Balkans. Now, the thing is that for 10 years, the Balkans moved in this direction. When it looked that they had a credible prospect of joining the EU, even the hardest nationalists, including Mr. Vučić, the current president of Serbia, moved more and more away from the hardline nationalism. And remember, when Serbia believed that it had a chance to join the EU, it was Vučić who, in order to have Serbia sign the association agreement, the trade agreement, and become a candidate and open accession talks, signed an incredible, seen from today's perspective, agreement with Kosovo, where Serbia said, we will not obstruct Kosovo joining institutions, we will accept that there will be multi-ethnic policing in all of Kosovo on its territory, integration, even in the Serb majority north of the judiciary system. You know, this Brussels agreement, Vučić signed it in 2012 because it was a condition by the EU for Serbia to open accession talks. The problem is that as the prospect of joining looks more and more like waiting for Godot, as you said, an absurd, empty process, which Vučić has realized and everybody else in the Balkans has realized, the incentive to make these steps of limiting nationalism and overcoming tensions disappears or weakens dramatically. So the answer to your question, why is the Balkans, because it's not stuck, it's going backwards. You have more rhetoric today about potential wars in the Balkans, in the media, in Serbia. Fears, scares, debates about states collapsing again. You have more of this kind of talk today than 5 years ago. And the answer to this has to be a revived, credible, but also realistic prospect of integration. So we get back to where we started. It's not just Ukraine and Moldova that need a credible perspective that is credible also in Paris and in The Hague. And that's why we propose focusing and reforming the accession process, making it a two-step process. It's also in the Balkans, because of course, nationalism can revive again. Putin and Russia is trying whatever it can to play on the divisions. You know, the Russian ambassador in Bosnia is constantly trying to meddle and stir up ethnic tensions. So is Viktor Orban, you know, who's been supporting Dodik. All the nationalists you mentioned are being supported by Hungarian diplomats, by Hungarian foreign policy. So in order to make conflict in the Balkans as unthinkable as it is in the rest of democratic Europe, the prospect of integration is crucial. And one measure of this, and a very concrete thing, is to hold out the prospect that with the same reforms that have been happening elsewhere in Europe, the borders between the countries in the Balkans will become invisible. Today, you don't see the border between Hungary and Romania and between Germany. Romania is still not in Schengen. Between Hungary and Slovakia, and between Germany and Poland, and between Switzerland, which is in Schengen, and Germany and France. These borders, because all countries are in a single market and you have freedom of movement and they've joined Schengen, the borders have become invisible. This should be the vision in the Balkans in the next 5 years.
And tragically, if you look at the statements from Emmanuel Macron about enlargement and those countries which we're talking about, these are the very countries we're talking about. What's he said? The analogy he's used is that they're not on the train, but they're possibly standing on the platform with tickets. The train can lead them there.
Yes, that's a quote I use a lot in my presentations as a reality check. And this needs to change. But the trouble is the French are worried that if you get on the train, there is an automatic trip straight to membership. And they say membership is too much. And what we say is that, no, get on the train, go towards membership, but there needs to be an interim stop, which is better for everyone, which is that these countries are integrated in the way Norway is today.
It sounds abstract, but the point is that the cost of this, you're saying, is possible or renewed war or renewed conflict.
The cost of this is already visible. It is a rhetoric where conflict becomes thinkable. And I tell you, those in Bosnia who return to their homes as minorities, for example, Croats and Bosniaks in Republika Srpska, or Serbs who returned as minority into majority Croat or Bosniak areas, who bet that there will never be a war again. That's why they return to the areas from which they were expelled by force. When they hear the talk that there might be division of countries, break apart of institutions, then they see the images of Ukraine, of cities being bombed, of borders, an attempt to change borders by force. I mean, this is traumatizing. So it's not even just the prospect of stopping things getting worse. We need to make war unthinkable again, today, in the Balkans. And the only way to do that, which isn't just wishful thinking and empty words, is to do what Europeans have done since 1950 with great success, which is to use economic integration and removing of barriers as a tool to build the kind of integration of economies and institutions that then make conflict unthinkable. And with all the criticisms, and it's an issue I work on a lot with my colleagues on the rule of law, the crisis in Hungary and Poland, the reality is that today we have no political prisoners in Poland and Hungary. I think the European Union has the tools to win the battle for the rule of law in those countries. And the Commission has, this year will be decisive, has actually finally, with a lot of delays, stepped up and is withholding money to Hungary, is withholding money to Poland. And these countries, and nobody is worried about a potential armed conflict between Poland and any of its neighbors. So, except Russia in Kaliningrad. So the promise of peace and stability that the European project has been launched with has been fulfilled, and the Balkans and Ukraine and Moldova need to be brought in.
Gerald, thank you very much indeed. I will just say that we are going to be running a study tour in the Balkans between June the 3rd, that's Saturday, June the 3rd, and Wednesday, June the 14th, covering both Kosovo, Serbia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, and there are places available on that tour. And we will go back over the course of the conflict, but also obviously more recent political developments. It's going to be a very interesting tour, and I'm sure we will revisit Gerald's arguments then when we're on that tour. Gerald, thank you very much indeed. It's been a really good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night and best wishes from Berlin.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Do stay with us just for a moment or two. My thanks again to Gerald Knaus for his wonderful insight into ESI's work and his arguments about Ukraine. Our upcoming talks for the rest of the month, we've got Christopher de Belague. There's even a de Belague watching this program, but it's not the same de Belague. He is going to be talking about Iran and the revolution, or the Islamic revolution, but also the protests on the streets, and that's this Thursday at 9 p.m. I'm very much looking forward to that. Christopher led us on 3 tours to Iran. Then Timothy Fadek, who's a very well-known photographer internationally and has been in Ukraine a lot over the last year, is going to be going back over his work there and elsewhere. That's on Tuesday, the 24th of January. These times are GMT. You'll have seen in your emails the times for your regions. And then Arisia Lutsevich, who works with Chatham House, he heads up the Ukraine program, is going to be speaking on Friday, the 27th of January. We think they'll get that again maybe at 9 p.m. GMT, but waiting for confirmation of the time. Just also a talk about tours upcoming. We are going to be in Lebanon between the 25th of March and the 2nd of April. And then we're going to be in the Balkans against Kosovo, Serbia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina between the 3rd of June and the 14th. And then we have later in the year, we've got Israel-Palestine in October, and South Africa again in November. So you should have all those tour dates in the emails that we've sent out to you. Gerald, any additional thoughts there? I can still see you there. Anything we missed out on?
No, all the best, and it's great to see that post-Corona you're back on tour and active.
Yeah, we're doing very well. As I said,
I hope I see you in Berlin or back in Germany sometime soon.
Yeah, I hope so too. It would be a good.
And the new German Minister of Defense, I traveled with him a lot in the last year. We went to Copenhagen together. Pistorius, might be interesting to.
I bet it's interesting because he's been the few things I've seen this evening say that he doesn't have a big foreign policy background. He's unproven. He doesn't know about the media. What's your take?
I mean, I didn't discuss foreign policy with him, but I had a lot of long discussions with him on what he was responsible for: migration policy, refugee, asylum.
Scholz is from Olaf Scholz.
I think he's going to be I hope, but I think there's reason to believe he will be a strong defense minister. And I think he can pick up at a very different moment in the German debate. I think it is a chance for the chancellery and for the government to come around a different policy to the really, for a big country like Germany, embarrassing lack of leadership on a vital issue for Europe. In the end, Germany has all. I mean, that's what the Ukrainian minister said recently. In the end, Germany has always done what the Ukrainians asked for, but with a great delay.
Let me just follow up on that, because with Angela Merkel, there was this sense of Ostpolitik, that she understood Putin. There's that sort of GDR background. She speaks Russian, and you needed to engage with Russia. Obviously, she's not chancellor. She wasn't chancellor at the time of this conflict, so she's not faced those decisions. But there's an argument that says that there was a strong legacy within the German foreign ministry of that policy, that kind of policy, and that although you have got a different government, that was basically what the German foreign ministry's attitude was, and any military policy would be held back by that.
It's interesting because here in Germany, the debate has moved in a very different direction. There's a lot of criticism where people say, yes, Angela Merkel understood Putin, she spoke Russian, but in the end, her policy was a complete failure. She did not support Ukraine. She did not believe Ukraine should be supported militarily. Turns out this was a mistake. If Ukraine would have been stronger, if there would have been more harsher reactions, Germany, yes, she put together some sanctions after 2014, but at the same time, Germany deepened its economic dependency on Russian energy. This was a signal that Putin understood as showing that in Germany, in the end, it was economic interests that dominated. And her legacy then, as a result, was one where Putin was left thinking that Germany would neither strongly support Ukraine, would not let Ukraine into the EU, would block Ukrainian NATO aspirations, would not supply Ukraine with weapons, that in the end he could count on the biggest European power watching him attack Ukraine.
But
because that's what happened after he attacked Georgia.
Yeah, but wouldn't the Social Democrats have come to the same conclusion, but for different reasons, with a different logic, essentially not wanting to have a more assertive Germany?
I mean, in the CDU, in Angela Merkel's party, a lot of the foreign policy people today look back, including some of her former ministers, the former Minister of Defense, look back and say, we were wrong. Our policy was bad. We underestimated the threat posed by Putin. We didn't listen to your East European neighbor, our Central European neighbors of Germany that warned us. We sent the wrong signals to Putin. We were either naive or focusing just on our economic self-interest, listening to industry, selling, even the gas storage to Gazprom. Today, in her own party, although she's still, there's still a lot of respect, she was a popular chancellor. These were good years for Germany. But when it comes to the policy towards the East, towards Russia and Ukraine, the emerging consensus is that it was a bad policy and it ended up in failure. And the transformation of Germany in the last few years in debating these issues is also turning its back on her legacy. because she didn't believe Ukraine could defend itself against Russia. Some of her military advisors, she's not responsible what her former advisors say today, but some of them are among the most open advocates of appeasement today. People that she has as advisors. And I highly respected her in many ways as the chancellor and what she did and her European convictions. But I think on Russia, on Ukraine, on Eastern Europe, in the end, her policy legacy ended up in complete failure. Germany did not prevent, and it could have, we never know what would have worked, but clearly it did not prevent Russia believing that it can invade Ukraine and get away with it. Yeah. Because Putin clearly thought he could get away with it. And that had a lot to do with not just Germany, but also Germany's policy. So there's been a lot of debate in the German media on.
But my point was, Gerald, that would the Social Democrats would surely have come to the same conclusion for the reasons you highlighted during the talk.
Yeah. No, it wasn't just Merkel. Clearly, no. It was a much broader. Even the Greens, who were the most on the energy policy, were most skeptical of the dependency on Russia and criticized it. Robert Habeck, actually, the current vice chancellor, the last summer before the elections in 2021, traveled to the front line in Ukraine and said one should think about supplying Ukraine with defensive weapons. No social democrat was saying this. He was attacked even within his own party at that time, but he did send the signal. but there was a broad consensus in Germany, which basically, and there's a lot of debate now, a lot of soul searching, that Germany only saw Russia, that there was an Orientalism, if you want, in its views on Eastern Europe, that it didn't really take the countries between Germany and Russia seriously. It thought it could manage Russia in this game of mutual economic benefits. And it was wishful thinking, very clearly. I mean, those who said, including some in the West, including many in Eastern Europe, that Putin, that his attack on Georgia, if it would not lead to a forceful response, and then, of course, his annexation of Crimea, and then the support for, the aggression in Eastern Ukraine, that all of this would lead him to want to be even more aggressive. And certainly when I was in Moscow in 2009, that's the impression I came away with, that this was right after the Georgia war, that this Russian leadership was preparing for a frontal attack.
I think in every one of our tours, that when we did multiple tours to Russia between 2012 and 2019, and the things that really strike me is a sort of Soviet nostalgia. The military parades, the red flag, people dressing
the
up. The
history books, rewrite. It's never innocent when you rewrite the history books, and Putin made this a project of the Kremlin. I mean, he put the current head of external intelligence, Narishkin, in charge of history books 10, 15 years ago, and rewrote the history books to make Stalin look again like the great leader. This rang alarm bells in the Baltic states and in Ukraine, because they all experienced what that meant. Yeah. But in Western Europe, this was all, and Germany especially, this was all underestimated.
Yeah, we were selling houses and taking nice commission fees on investments here in London. Thank you very much, Gerald. It's been really good.
All the best. Take care.